I'm Sophia Mitchell, 26 years old, and I never thought I'd be forcibly removed from my own hotel. But there I was, standing in the grand lobby of the Royal Crown Hotel as security escorted me out, my stepfather Richard smirking while my mother Catherine looked away. I clutched the inheritance letter from my grandmother Margaret, my hands shaking with rage. I was just kicked out of my own hotel, the one my grandmother built from nothing and legally left to me, but they had no idea what Grandma Margaret had planned all along. Before I dive into this unbelievable story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button if you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted, and subscribe to hear more stories about standing up for yourself against all odds. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. My grandmother Margaret Mitchell was a legend in the hotel industry. A strong-willed, sharp-minded businesswoman who built her empire from scratch in an era when female executives were practically unheard of. By the time I was born, she had established 7 luxury properties in major cities across the country, collectively worth over $50 million. The Royal Crown in New York was her crowning jewel, a historic landmark known for its impeccable service and old-world elegance. Growing up, I spent every summer working in her hotels, starting as a housekeeper at 15 and working my way through different departments. The only way to lead is to know every job in your business, she'd tell me. While my mother Catherine preferred shopping and charity luncheons, I was fascinated by Grandma's world of business negotiations and customer service excellence. My grandmother's eyes would light up when I'd ask questions about occupancy rates and revenue management. "You have the Mitchell touch, Sophia," she'd say, squeezing my hand. "This will all be yours someday." I didn't realize how soon someday would arrive. Everything changed 3 years ago when my mother, who had been divorced from my father for nearly a decade, met Richard Harrison at a fundraising gala. Tall, distinguished, with salt and pepper hair and an impressive resume in investment banking, he swept her off her feet with exotic vacations and lavish gifts. Within 6 months, they were engaged. "He makes me feel special again," my mother gushed over lunch, flashing her enormous diamond ring. I was happy for her, despite my reservations about the whirlwind romance. Richard was charming enough when we met, complimenting my business degree and asking thoughtful questions about my career goals. "Your mother tells me you're following in your grandmother's footsteps," he said, raising his wine glass. To the future CEO of Mitchell Hotels. Grandma Margaret, however, wasn't as easily impressed. When I visited her penthouse apartment the week before the wedding, she was uncharacteristically blunt. "I don't trust that man," she said, her arthritis-gnarled fingers tapping against her teacup. "I've known his type my entire career. All polish, no substance." "Mom seems happy," I countered, though I shared some of her misgivings. "Just promise me you'll be careful, Sophia. Men like Richard don't marry for love. They marry for advantage." I dismissed her concerns as the protective instincts of a woman who'd fought too many battles in a man's world. I should have listened more carefully. 2 months after the wedding, Grandma was diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. The decline was swift and merciless. As she grew weaker, Richard became increasingly present in family business discussions, offering to ease her burden by taking over some operational responsibilities. My mother supported this, believing it would give Grandma peace of mind. In her final week, Grandma asked to speak with me alone. Her once commanding presence was diminished in the hospital bed, but her mind remained sharp. "The hotels will be yours, Sophia," she whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Don't let anyone take them from you. Promise me." "I promise," I said, tears streaming down my face. She died peacefully the next morning. The funeral was a who's who of the hospitality industry, with competitors and colleagues alike paying respects to a pioneer. Throughout the service, I noticed Richard consoling my mother while simultaneously networking with industry executives, exchanging business cards between condolences. "We should discuss the family business soon," he murmured to me at the reception, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "Your mother will need support managing everything." 1 week later, we gathered in Benjamin Wright's office, my grandmother's attorney for over 30 years. The reading of the will was straightforward. Margaret Mitchell had left her entire hotel empire to me, with the stipulation that I complete a degree in hospitality management to fully understand all aspects of the business. I'll never forget the look that passed between my mother and Richard when Benjamin read that part of the will. It was brief, a flash of shock, followed by barely concealed anger, but I caught it. In that moment, I understood what my grandmother had been warning me about. "This is wonderful," Richard recovered quickly, smiling too broadly. "But of course, Sophia will need guidance while she completes her education. Catherine and I would be happy to oversee operations temporarily." I nodded noncommittally, already feeling the first threads of the web closing around me. The manipulation began subtly. Richard started joining me for weekly meetings with hotel executives, offering insights that sounded impressive but often contradicted my grandmother's business philosophy. He emphasized cost-cutting over the personalized luxury service that had made Mitchell Hotels famous. "Times have changed, Sophia," he'd say whenever I objected. "Your grandmother ran things the old way, but we need to modernize to stay competitive." My mother backed him at every turn. "Richard has so much experience in finance, sweetheart. We're lucky to have his expertise." About 2 months after the funeral, Richard arranged a family dinner at La Belle, the 5-star restaurant in the Royal Crown. The elegant private dining room had been the site of many business celebrations with my grandmother. Now it felt like a trap. "I've been reviewing the financials," Richard began, after ordering an expensive bottle of champagne. "The hotels are underperforming compared to industry standards." "That's not true," I countered. "Our occupancy rates exceed the luxury market average by 8%. "Yes, but the profit margins are slimmer than they should be," he continued smoothly. "Your grandmother was generous to a fault with employee benefits and guest amenities. It's unsustainable." My mother reached for my hand across the table. "Sophia, we're concerned about your inheritance. These hotels represent your future, but they need proper management." "I am planning to manage them," I said. "That's why I'm starting the hospitality program at Boston University in the fall, just like Grandma wanted." Richard nodded sympathetically. "Of course, and that's commendable. But your education will take time, at least 2 years. Meanwhile, the business needs immediate attention." He pulled out a folder filled with documents. "We've consulted with Albert Spencer, a brilliant attorney who specializes in family businesses. He's drafted a management agreement that makes perfect sense until you complete your degree." The proposal seemed reasonable on the surface. Richard would oversee operations while I focused on my education, with quarterly reviews of major decisions. What I didn't realize until later was how the fine print gave him almost complete control with minimal accountability. "This is just temporary," my mother assured me. "We want to protect your inheritance while you focus on learning the business from the ground up, just like your grandmother wanted." I hesitated, sensing a trap but unable to articulate exactly what was wrong. I was grieving, overwhelmed, and desperate to honor my grandmother's wishes by completing the education she'd specified. "You don't have to decide tonight," Richard said generously. "Take the papers home, review them." But the pressure continued for weeks. My mother called daily, increasingly emotional. "Richard is just trying to help," she'd cry. "Why won't you let us support you? I've lost my mother, and now I feel like I'm losing my daughter too." The emotional manipulation worked. 3 weeks later, I signed the documents in Albert Spencer's sleek downtown office, Richard's friend and attorney, who I'd never met before. The moment the pen left the paper, Richard's demeanor subtly shifted. He was still polite, still called me dear, but there was a newfound confidence in his posture. I moved to Boston the following month to start my program, throwing myself into my studies. The coursework was fascinating, connecting the practical experience I'd gained working in the hotels with theoretical frameworks of hospitality management. For the first time since my grandmother died, I felt purposeful. Then I noticed the discrepancies. It started with the monthly financial statements, which according to our agreement were supposed to be sent to me for review. The first batch arrived late and contained unusual transfers to consulting companies I'd never heard of. When I called the corporate office to inquire, I was redirected multiple times before finally reaching Richard. "Those are efficiency consultants," he explained dismissively. "Standard practice these days. Nothing to worry about." Grandma never used outside consultants. She believed in developing talent internally. "Your grandmother ran a good operation for her time," Richard said with the patience one might use with a child. "But the industry has evolved. Trust me, Sophia. This is business. You'll learn about modern management practices in school." When I pressed further, he grew irritated. "Look, If you want to waste time questioning every decision instead of focusing on your education, that's your choice. But your mother is already stressed about your absence. Do you really want to upset her more? I backed down, but my suspicions grew when I received an email from Jessica Ryan, the longtime general manager at our San Francisco property, saying she'd been let go. Jessica had been with my grandmother for 15 years. I called her immediately. "It's happening across all the hotels," she told me. "Anyone loyal to your grandmother is being replaced. Richard claims it's restructuring, but it feels personal." When I confronted my mother about Jessica and the other terminations, she sighed heavily. "Your grandmother was sentimental about employees, even when they weren't performing. Richard is making necessary changes. Please, Sophia, focus on your studies. That's what Mother wanted." Her words echoed Richard so precisely that I knew she was repeating his talking points. The woman who once supported my grandmother's business decisions now deferred completely to her new husband. It was the first clear betrayal, and it hurt more than I could have imagined. 6 months into my program at Boston University, I was excelling academically, but increasingly disturbed by the reports coming from the hotel group. While my official financial statements showed stable performance, I was receiving concerned emails from long-term employees about radical changes happening across all properties. Richard had implemented a modernization initiative that seemed designed to erase my grandmother's legacy. The personalized welcome gifts for returning guests, a signature touch that had earned us loyal customers for decades, were eliminated as unnecessary expenses. The locally sourced seasonal flowers in the lobbies were replaced with artificial arrangements. Staff uniforms designed by my grandmother, with both elegance and comfort in mind, were swapped for generic, cheaper alternatives. During winter break, I flew to New York, determined to assess the situation firsthand. The moment I walked into the Royal Crown, I felt the difference. The doorman who had greeted guests by name for 20 years was gone, replaced by a young man who barely looked up from his phone. The lobby, once vibrant with conversation and live piano music, was eerily quiet. The pianist, another casualty of budget cuts. I scheduled an executive meeting, using my technical authority as owner to force Richard to include me. The conference room was filled with unfamiliar faces, Richard's new hires who regarded me with thinly veiled skepticism. "Sophia has some ideas she'd like to share," Richard announced, his tone subtly condescending. "Let's all remember she's still learning the business." I presented data showing customer satisfaction had dropped 15% since the changes began. "Our repeat business has always been our strength," I explained. "These cuts are damaging our brand identity." Richard chuckled, glancing around the table as if sharing a private joke with his team. "This is adorable. Sophia's bringing her school project to our meeting." Several executives snickered. "These aren't school projects," I countered, heat rising in my cheeks. "These are actual customer feedback reports." "We appreciate your enthusiasm," Richard said, standing to signal the end of my presentation. "But business decisions need to be based on bottom-line realities, not sentiment. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have actual operational issues to discuss." I looked to my mother, who sat silently at Richard's right hand. She avoided my eyes, fidgeting with her bracelet, a gift from my grandmother on her 50th birthday. Later that evening, she came to my old room, where I was still staying during the break. "You embarrassed Richard today," she said without preamble. "I was trying to protect Grandma's legacy. Your grandmother is gone, Sophia. The hotels are just buildings and businesses, not shrines. Richard is making necessary changes to secure our financial future." "Our financial future?" I echoed. Grandma left the hotels to me. Something flashed in my mother's eyes. Resentment, perhaps jealousy. "And who raised you while she was building her precious empire? Who sat alone at dinner tables because she was always working?" "Me. I gave up my own dreams to be her daughter and your mother while she played businesswoman." The bitterness in her voice shocked me. I'd never realized she harbored such resentment toward my grandmother. "Is that why you're letting Richard dismantle everything she built? As some kind of revenge?" "Don't be melodramatic," she snapped. "Richard knows what he's doing. If you can't support us, at least don't interfere." After she left, I wandered the mansion where I'd spent so many happy weekends with my grandmother. On impulse, I went to her office, a beautiful space overlooking Central Park that had remained largely untouched since her death. Or so I thought. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything had changed. My grandmother's antique mahogany desk had been replaced by a sleek, modern monstrosity. Her carefully curated art collection pieces by female artists she'd supported throughout her career were gone, replaced by generic corporate prints. Every trace of Margaret Mitchell had been systematically removed. As I stood there absorbing the shock, I noticed a storage box partially hidden behind the new desk. Peering inside, I found framed photos of my grandmother with various dignitaries and celebrities who had stayed at her hotels over the years, important documentation of the brand's prestigious history, now discarded like trash. I grabbed the box, determined to preserve these artifacts, when Richard appeared in the doorway. Looking for something? His voice was cold, all pretense of familial warmth abandoned. These belong in the hotel archives. They're part of our history. History doesn't pay the bills, Sophia. Neither does sentimentality. He crossed the room and took the box from my hands. Focus on your studies and leave the business to adults who understand how the real world works. Your grandmother is dead, he cut in brutally. And if you keep undermining me, I might reconsider financing that expensive education she insisted upon. Think carefully about your next move. As I returned to Boston, I realized the situation was worse than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about control anymore. Richard was systematically erasing my grandmother's legacy while isolating me from any allies within the company. I needed help, but I had no idea where to turn. Back at Boston University, I felt completely isolated. Richard had effectively cut me off from the hotel operations, and my mother had chosen his side. I threw myself into my studies, hoping the knowledge would eventually help me reclaim what was rightfully mine. But the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. Everything changed the day Professor James Reynolds paused after class, studying me with unusual interest. Mitchell. Any relation to Margaret Mitchell of Mitchell Hotels? She was my grandmother, I replied cautiously, wary of revealing too much. His face lit up. Margaret was a pioneer. We served together on the International Hospitality Ethics Board for years. Brilliant woman, tough as nails but always fair. For the first time in months, I found myself talking to someone who had actually known my grandmother as a businesswoman, not just as a wealthy relative to be exploited. Over coffee in his office, I cautiously shared my situation. Something seemed off when I didn't see her at the funeral, James said, brow furrowing. Margaret always said she had contingency plans for everything. It doesn't sound like her to leave her life's work vulnerable. The will was clear, I said. The hotels are mine once I complete this degree. But Richard convinced my mother to give him operational control in the meantime. James leaned forward. There's someone you should meet. Benjamin Wright was your grandmother's attorney, correct? Yes, but he's been replaced. Richard brought in his own lawyer. Convenient, James muttered. Benjamin and I go way back. Let me make a call. 3 days later, I met Benjamin Wright in a quiet cafe several blocks from campus. The distinguished attorney had aged considerably since the will reading. His shoulders stooped with what seemed like defeat. I've been hoping you'd reach out, he said after we ordered. I should have contacted you directly, but Richard threatened legal action if I interfered with family matters. Can he do that? Benjamin sighed. Technically, no. But he made it clear he'd make things extremely unpleasant, potentially costly for my firm. I'm ashamed to say I backed down. He reached for his briefcase, but I've been keeping records. What he showed me confirmed my worst fears. Richard had systematically changed every operating agreement, leveraging the temporary management arrangement into what amounted to a hostile takeover. My name remained on the ownership documents, but operational control had been so thoroughly transferred that challenging him would require extensive litigation. There's more, Benjamin said grimly. I've heard through industry contacts that he's preparing to sell the San Francisco property. Once that's done, the others will likely follow. He can't sell what he doesn't own, I protested. With the documents you signed, he effectively can. The language gives him authority to restructure assets for optimal performance. I felt physically ill. Why would he do this? The hotels are profitable. Why destroy them? Benjamin's expression darkened. I did some digging after I was dismissed. Richard Harrison has a history of failed businesses and massive debt. 3 companies driven to bankruptcy. Multiple lawsuits settled quietly. He needs cash, and your hotels are his ticket out of financial ruin. As devastating as this information was, it gave me something I desperately needed: confirmation I wasn't crazy or paranoid. Richard was exactly what my grandmother had suspected: a predator. The next day, I received an unexpected email from Andrea Parker, my grandmother's former executive assistant, who had been among the first employees Richard terminated. She asked to meet urgently. We connected via video call that evening. Andrea looked different, her previously perfect corporate appearance replaced by a more casual style, but her razor-sharp intelligence remained unchanged. "I've been watching from the sidelines," she said without preamble. "It's worse than you know. Richard isn't just cutting costs. He's extracting value before a sale. Classic strip and flip operation." "How do you know this?" "I still have friends inside. Plus," she smiled slyly, "your grandmother taught me well. I've been monitoring public records, real estate listings, corporate filings. The Chicago property is being quietly shown to potential buyers through a shell company." Between Andrea, Benjamin, and James, I suddenly had the beginnings of a team, people who had known and respected my grandmother, who understood what was at stake beyond the monetary value. "There's something else," Andrea said, her expression turning serious. 3 days before she died, your grandmother sent me to a safety deposit box. She said if anything seemed irregular after her death, I should make sure this package reached you directly. A week later, a nondescript envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was a single key with a numbered tag and a handwritten note in my grandmother's distinctive script: "For when the sharks begin to circle, you'll know when." I stared at the mysterious key, wondering what door it might open and what secrets lay behind it. Whatever my grandmother had planned, it was clear she'd anticipated Richard's betrayal long before anyone else. For the first time since her death, I felt a flicker of hope. "Grandma," I whispered to the empty room, "I think it's time." December arrived with a bitter cold snap that seemed fitting for my return to New York. My second year in the hospitality program was going well. I had maintained a perfect GPA while secretly building my alliance against Richard. Now it was time to see firsthand what had become of my inheritance during my absence. The family mansion, where my grandmother had lived for over 40 years, was barely recognizable. Richard and my mother had redecorated extensively, replacing the warm, elegant decor with ostentatious modern pieces that looked like they belonged in a nouveau-rich reality show. My grandmother's collection of historical hospitality artifacts, antique hotel registers, vintage luggage, bell captain uniforms from the early 1900s had been removed from their custom display cases. In their place stood garish sculptures and my mother's new art collection, pieces clearly selected for price rather than quality. "Do you like what we've done?" my mother asked, gesturing grandly as she gave me a tour. "Richard says the old decor was depressing. This is much more current." I bit my tongue, saving my strength for the bigger battles ahead. The annual Mitchell family Christmas gathering had been a tradition since before I was born. A warm, festive event where hotel staff and executives were treated like extended family. This year's version was unrecognizable. Instead of the inclusive celebration my grandmother had created, Richard had transformed it into a networking event for his new business associates, men with slick hair and predatory smiles, who seemed more interested in deal-making than holiday cheer. I circulated quietly, gathering intelligence. Snippets of conversation confirmed what Andrea had warned me about. Multiple properties were being prepared for sale, with interested buyers already touring facilities. Richard clinked his glass for attention midway through the evening, his arm around my mother's waist. "I'd like to make an announcement," he declared to the room. "Mitchell Hotels is entering an exciting new chapter. We're launching a complete rebranding initiative in the new year. Farewell to the outdated Mitchell name, and hello to Harrison Luxury Properties." Scattered applause followed, primarily from Richard's sycophants. Longtime employees looked uncomfortable, exchanging concerned glances. "Additionally," he continued, "I'm pleased to announce that we've finalized negotiations with Global Hospitality Group. They'll be acquiring our flagship Royal Crown property as part of their international collection." The room spun around me. The Royal Crown, my grandmother's first hotel, the cornerstone of her empire, the building where she'd maintained her personal suite until her death sold to a corporate chain known for stripping historic properties of their character. "You can't do this," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs of surprise. The room fell silent. Richard's smile remained fixed, though his eyes hardened. "Sophia, this isn't the time for—" "The royal crown isn't yours to sell," I continued, stepping forward. "None of the hotels are. You've manipulated your way into temporary control, but the ownership remains mine." "Sophia," my mother gasped. "You're embarrassing yourself." "Am I?" I turned to address the room. "Did everyone here know that Richard Harrison has driven 3 previous companies into bankruptcy? That he's being sued by former business partners for fraud? That he's desperately selling off my grandmother's legacy to cover his own massive debts?" Richard's face contorted with rage. "That's enough." He moved toward me, but several guests stepped back, creating an uncomfortable space around us. "The truth is uncomfortable, isn't it?" I continued, riding a wave of righteous anger. "You married my mother for access to our family's wealth. You've been systematically firing anyone loyal to my grandmother and replacing them with your cronies. You're not modernizing, you're looting." "Catherine," Richard snapped at my mother. "Control your daughter." My mother stepped forward, her face flushed with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. "Sophia, you've gone too far. Richard is doing what's best for all of us." "Is he? Or is he doing what's best for Richard?" I turned to her, hoping to break through whatever spell he had cast. "Grandma built this company for us, for you too. Are you really okay with him erasing her name, selling her life's work, destroying her legacy?" What my mother said next shattered any illusion that she was merely an innocent bystander in Richard's schemes. "Your grandmother's legacy was more important to her than I ever was," she hissed, her composed socialite mask slipping to reveal the resentment beneath. "She spent my entire childhood building her precious hotels while I was raised by nannies. Then she had the audacity to bypass me entirely in her will, her own daughter to leave everything to you, who she barely knew for 20 years. "She didn't barely know me," I protested. "We were close. I worked in the hotels. I learned the business." "Because you were useful to her business," my mother cried. "Margaret Mitchell only valued people who served her ambitions. I spent my life trying to earn her approval and never got it. So yes, I supported Richard taking control. Those hotels should have been mine to begin with." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My mother hadn't been manipulated by Richard. She'd been a willing accomplice, motivated by decades of jealousy and perceived injustice. Richard, recovering his composure, smiled thinly. "I think it's best if you leave, Sophia. You're clearly upset and not thinking rationally." 2 security guards appeared, men I didn't recognize, not the longtime staff who had known me since childhood. They moved toward me with practiced efficiency. "You're having me removed from my own family's home? At Christmas?" I looked around at the uncomfortable guests, many now studying their drinks intently. "This is our home now," Richard said coldly, "and you're no longer welcome until you learn to behave appropriately." As the guards escorted me out, I caught a glimpse of my mother's face. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when doubt clouded her expression, but it passed quickly, replaced by the hard mask of someone who had committed too deeply to a destructive path to turn back. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the elegant flakes illuminated by the mansion's exterior lighting. I stood on the driveway, shivering without my coat, watching the party continue through the windows as if nothing had happened. Numbly, I walked to the garden, my grandmother's pride and joy. A formal English landscape she had tended personally despite her busy schedule. Even in winter, under a thin layer of snow, it retained a sense of her presence. I sank onto a stone bench beside the dormant rose bushes, the cold seeping through my thin cocktail dress. "What do I do now, Grandma?" I whispered to the silent garden. As if in answer, a memory surfaced: my grandmother, kneeling in this very garden, showing me how to prune roses when I was perhaps 10 years old. "The secret to roses," she had said, "is knowing which cuts make them stronger. Sometimes, what looks like damage is actually making room for new growth." I stared at the rosebush beside me, its woody stems waiting out the winter. Something caught my eye: an irregularity in the perfectly maintained garden. A loose stone in the decorative border surrounding the rosebeds. Curious, I leaned closer. The stone shifted under my touch, revealing a small waterproof container nestled in the soil beneath. Inside was a sealed envelope, my name written in my grandmother's handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened it. "My dearest Sophia," it began, "if you're reading this, then my concerns about Richard have proven justified. The key I left you opens storage unit 217 at Secure Storage on West 53rd Street. Everything you need is there. Remember what I always told you. In business and in life, always have a backup plan. I've prepared yours. All my love, Grandma Margaret." I clutched the letter to my chest, tears freezing on my cheeks in the December air. My grandmother, even from beyond the grave, was still protecting me, still fighting. And now, it was time for me to fight too. The storage unit contained what looked like a lifetime of preparation for exactly this scenario. Neatly labeled boxes held financial records dating back decades, duplicate copies of contracts, and most valuably detailed documentation of my grandmother's contingency plans. "She started preparing for this possibility the day your mother met Richard," Benjamin Wright explained as we sorted through the materials in his office. Margaret had an investigator run a background check immediately. What he found confirmed her suspicions. The background report was damning. Richard's business failures weren't just bad luck, they were calculated schemes. He had a pattern of insinuating himself into successful businesses, gaining control, extracting value, and then abandoning the hollowed-out remains. 3 ex-wives had similar stories of financial exploitation. "Your grandmother knew exactly what he was after," Andrea said, reviewing the files. "She just didn't expect Catherine to be so complicit." My team had grown. Along with Benjamin, James, and Andrea, we'd brought in Sophia's former chief financial officer, Michael Chen, who had resigned rather than implement Richard's questionable financial strategies, and Thomas Green, the longtime manager of the Royal Crown, who was still employed but secretly feeding us information. "Richard's making his move on the Chicago property next week," Thomas reported during one of our secure video calls. "The paperwork's being prepared to transfer ownership to a holding company he controls. That gives us a deadline," James noted. "We need to execute before any properties actually change hands." Our plan took shape as we pieced together my grandmother's legal strategy. The management agreement I had signed contained a critical vulnerability, a breach of fiduciary duty clause that would invalidate the entire arrangement if Richard was found to be acting against the company's interests. "The problem is proving it," Benjamin explained. "We need documented evidence of self-dealing or fraud. Suspicions aren't enough." That's where my grandmother's foresight proved invaluable. She had established a secret trust with its own investigator who had continued monitoring Richard even after her death. The files contained transactions, recordings of conversations, and email exchanges showing Richard's intent to strip assets and sell properties for personal gain. We spent weeks building our case, working around my class schedule and being careful to maintain the appearance of a defeated, disinterested heiress whenever I interacted with my mother or Richard. Spring break provided the perfect opportunity for our evidence-gathering road trip. James, Andrea, and I traveled to multiple cities, retrieving documents from various safety deposit boxes my grandmother had established, each containing pieces of the puzzle. In Chicago, we met with former employees who provided witness statements about Richard's dismantling of successful operations. In Los Angeles, we accessed financial records showing money being siphoned to consulting companies owned by Richard's associates. The most damning evidence came from San Francisco, where the hotel's former legal counsel had kept recordings of Richard explicitly discussing plans to extract maximum value before dumping the properties. "Your grandmother was a chess player," Benjamin said admiringly as our evidence mounted. "She saw this coming and prepared moves in advance." "But why not just disinherit my mother entirely?" I asked during one strategy session. "Why leave this opening at all?" Andrea smiled sadly. She always hoped Catherine would eventually see through Richard's facade. "The arrangement was designed to protect you while giving your mother a chance to make the right choice." As our preparation reached its final stages, Richard somehow caught wind of our investigation. The first warning came when Thomas texted urgently, "R asking questions about SF documents. Be careful." That evening, I returned to my apartment to find the door ajar. Inside, everything had been ransacked, drawers emptied, furniture upturned. My grandmother's photos had been removed from their frames and torn to pieces. The message was clear. My phone rang almost immediately. My mother, "Richard knows what you're doing," she said without preamble, her voice uncharacteristically tight with tension. "He's furious, Sophia. I've never seen him like this." "Then maybe you should ask yourself why he's so threatened by the truth," I replied, surveying the destruction of my home. "Stop this investigation now," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "Before someone gets hurt." "Is that a threat?" A pause. "It's a warning. Richard has task connections. People who handle problems for him. Please, just sign the papers transferring full control and move on with your life. He'll give you a generous settlement. I'm not selling my grandmother's legacy." "She's dead, Sophia." My mother's voice cracked with emotion. "These are just buildings, just businesses. They're not worth risking everything for." "They're worth it to me," I said quietly. "And they were worth it to Grandma." After we hung up, I called Benjamin immediately. "We need to move our timeline up. Richard's getting desperate." "We're not quite ready," he cautioned. "The injunction paperwork, he just had my apartment trashed, and my mother called with thinly veiled threats. Next time, it might not just be property that gets damaged." We accelerated our preparations, working through the night to finalize documentation. By morning, our plan was in place. It was time to spring my grandmother's hidden trap. May arrived with the completion of my final semester. While my classmates celebrated with parties and job interviews, I was preparing for the most important business meeting of my life. Richard had scheduled an executive board session to finalize the sale of the Royal Crown, a perfect opportunity for our countermove. Our intelligence suggested Richard believed he'd found a legal loophole that would allow him to permanently transfer ownership despite my grandmother's will. He had no idea we were several steps ahead, thanks to Margaret Mitchell's meticulous planning. "Are you ready for this?" James asked as we prepared in a hotel suite across town from the Mitchell corporate offices. After serving as my mentor throughout the program, he had taken a week's leave to support me through this final phase. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, smoothing my grandmother's vintage Hermes scarf, a gift on my 21st birthday that I wore for courage. Benjamin reviewed our strategy one final time. "Remember, timing is everything. Let Richard fully present his plan before we intervene. We need the board members to witness his intentions clearly." Andrea adjusted my lapel microphone, disguised as a brooch that had belonged to my grandmother. "Every word will be recorded. Just stay calm and follow the script." At precisely 10 a.m., our team entered the Mitchell Hotel's executive boardroom. The shock on Richard's face when he saw me flanked by Benjamin, Andrea, and a team of attorneys was priceless. "Sophia," he recovered quickly, smile not reaching his eyes. "What a surprise. I wasn't aware you'd be joining us today." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied evenly. "After all, we're discussing the sale of my hotel." Richard's new board members, mostly friends and associates, he'd appointed after forcing out the original directors, shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Richard began. "Actually," I interrupted, "I believe transparency is best when making decisions about a $50 million family business. Please, continue with your presentation." "I'm very interested in hearing about the sale of the Royal Crown." Trapped by his own agenda, Richard proceeded to outline his plan for strategic divestment of the flagship property. He spoke of maximizing shareholder value and capital redeployment opportunities. Corporate doublespeak designed to obscure the simple fact that he was selling off my inheritance for quick cash. And as you can see, he concluded, projecting a complex organizational chart, the restructured ownership model gives us complete flexibility to proceed with this transaction immediately. "That's fascinating," I said when he finished. "Just one question. How exactly does this arrangement comply with my grandmother's will, which explicitly leaves ownership of all properties to me?" Richard's smile tightened. "The management agreement you signed gives me full operational authority, including strategic decisions about property holdings." "Ah, you mean this agreement?" I placed a document on the table. "The one that includes Section 7.3, stating that any action taken against the long-term interests of Mitchell Hotels constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and renders the entire agreement void?" A muscle twitched in Richard's jaw, Selling one underperforming property to reinvest in the others hardly constitutes, except that's not what you're doing, is it? I nodded to Benjamin, who distributed folders to everyone present. These documents show that the proceeds from the planned sale would not be reinvested in Mitchell Hotels at all. They would be diverted to cover personal debts and obligations belonging to Richard Harrison. The boardroom erupted in murmurs as directors flipped through the evidence bank statements, transfer records, and emails that painted a clear picture of financial misconduct. "This is absurd," Richard sputtered. "These documents are fabricated." "Catherine," he turned to my mother, who sat frozen beside him. "Tell them this is ridiculous." My mother said nothing, her face pale as she stared at the evidence before her. "If I might continue," I said calmly. "There's more you should all know." I nodded to Andrea, who activated a presentation on the boardroom screen. My grandmother suspected something like this might happen. What none of you know is that she established a secondary will and trust that would activate under specific conditions. Richard laughed dismissively. "There was no secondary will. This is desperate fiction." Benjamin stood. "As Margaret Mitchell's attorney for 30 years, I can confirm the existence of the Mitchell Contingency Trust, triggered by any attempt to sell the Royal Crown property. I have the notarized documents here." He placed the trust documents on the table. Additionally, upon Mrs. Mitchell's instruction, a private investigation of Mr. Harrison began the day he became involved with Catherine Mitchell. The findings are quite illuminating. The presentation displayed Richard's history of failed businesses, lawsuits from former partners alleging fraud, and documentation of massive personal debts information my grandmother had gathered long before her death. "You had no right," Richard began, his face darkening. "Actually, she had every right to protect her life's work," I cut in, "especially when she discovered your previous pattern of marrying wealthy women, gaining control of their assets, and leaving financial disaster in your wake." I turned to address the board directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Harrison has been systematically dismantling this company for personal gain. Today, I am exercising my rights as the legal owner of Mitchell Hotels to terminate the management agreement on grounds of breach of fiduciary duty." Richard shot to his feet. "This is preposterous. Catherine and I have operational control." "Not anymore," Benjamin interjected, sliding another document forward. "This court order, issued this morning, freezes all Mitchell assets pending investigation of financial impropriety. Mr. Harrison is prohibited from making any further decisions regarding company operations." The blood drained from Richard's face as he snatched up the court order. "This won't stand," he growled. "I have connections." "Yes, we know about your connections too," I said quietly, nodding to Andrea, who switched the presentation to surveillance photos of Richard meeting with known financial criminals. Grandmother was very thorough. The boardroom fell silent. Richard looked wildly around at the directors, searching for allies, but found none. Even his appointed board members were distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with such blatant misconduct. My mother finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "Did you know about the debts, the lawsuits? Was any of it real?" Richard ignored her, turning on me with naked hatred. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you're doing. These hotels will fail without my management. You're just a child playing at business. I'm Margaret Mitchell's granddaughter." I corrected him. "And unlike you, I actually learned the business from the ground up." He lunged for the presentation laptop, as if destroying the evidence could somehow save him. Security, the original team my grandmother had trusted for years, quietly reinstated for today's meeting, quickly restrained him. "Mr. Harrison," the chief of security said formally, "I'll need you to leave the premises." "This is my company," Richard shouted as they escorted him toward the door. "No," I said, feeling my grandmother's presence beside me. "It never was." As Richard was removed from the boardroom, hurling threats and obscenities, I turned to the shell-shocked directors. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mitchell Hotels has weathered this storm, but we have work to do to restore what's been damaged. Those of you willing to help rebuild are welcome to stay. Those who were complicit in Mr. Harrison's schemes should tender your resignations immediately." One by one, Richard's appointees quietly gathered their things and left. When the room had cleared, except for my team and a few longtime directors, my mother remained seated, staring at her hands. "What happens now?" she asked, not meeting my eyes. It was the question I'd been asking myself for months. What do you do with a mother who betrayed you? Who chose greed and resentment over family loyalty? "That depends," I said finally, "on whether you're ready to make different choices." Richard's counterattack came swiftly and viciously. Within hours of being removed from the boardroom, he had frozen every Mitchell Hotel's bank account he had access to, effectively crippling operations across all properties. Employees couldn't be paid, vendors went unpaid, and reservation systems were locked down. "He's scorching the earth," Michael Chen observed grimly as we assessed the damage. "If he can't have the hotels, he'll try to destroy them." "We anticipated this," Benjamin reminded us. "The emergency operating fund your grandmother established should carry us through until the accounts are released." Indeed, my grandmother had set aside a substantial reserve in an account Richard knew nothing about, accessible only to me with Benjamin as trustee. It was enough to maintain critical operations while we fought the legal battle. The media quickly caught wind of the scandal. Hotel Iris accuses stepfather of fraud blazed across business publications and gossip columns alike. Richard, never one to miss a PR opportunity, launched a coordinated smear campaign. Catherine and I only wanted to protect the business from an inexperienced, emotionally unstable young woman, he told reporters outside his attorney's office. Sophia Mitchell is attempting a hostile takeover of her mother's company, driven by jealousy and resentment of her mother's new marriage. The narrative might have gained traction if not for the mountain of evidence we continued to release through strategic legal filings. Each court document revealed new aspects of Richard's misconduct, turning public opinion decisively in our favor. Still, Richard had powerful connections and wasn't going down without a fight. His attorneys filed countersuits, claiming I had breached our agreement, demanding millions in compensation for his expert management services. The pressure intensified when my mother requested a private meeting. We met at a neutral location, a small cafe, far from both the corporate offices and the family mansion. "Richard wants to make a deal," she said without preamble, looking exhausted and years older than when I'd last seen her. "He'll drop all claims if you agree to give him the San Francisco property outright. One hotel in exchange for peace." "Is that what you want me to do?" I asked, studying her face for any sign of the mother I'd once known. She hesitated. "He says it's the only way to avoid years of expensive litigation that will damage the Mitchell name." "And what do you say?" Her eyes finally met mine. "I don't know anymore, Sophia," I thought. I believed he loved me, that everything he did was for us. But these past weeks, seeing the evidence, the way he talks about you, she trailed off. "He never loved you, Mom. You were just his access point to Grandma's money." Tears filled her eyes. I was so angry at her for so long, for choosing the business over me, for connecting with you in ways she never did with me. When she left everything to you, it felt like one final rejection. "She didn't reject you," I said softly. "She protected you the only way she could by leaving the hotels to someone Richard couldn't manipulate." "I've made such a terrible mistake," she whispered. "Yes," I agreed, unwilling to soften the truth. "But you can still help fix it. Testify about what you've witnessed. Help us end this quickly." She looked terrified. "Richard would never forgive me." "Do you really want forgiveness from a man who used you to steal your family's legacy?" 3 days later, my mother provided a sworn deposition detailing Richard's schemes, his admissions to her about his plans for the hotels, and his desperate need for cash to cover massive gambling debts. Her testimony was devastating to Richard's defense. With his legal options narrowing, Richard made one last desperate move. Our security team intercepted him, attempting to board a private plane to a non-extradition country, carrying several briefcases filled with cash and bearer bonds diverted from hotel accounts. The airport arrest was dramatic, captured by news cameras that happened to be covering an arriving celebrity. Richard, handcuffed and raging, became the lead story on every network. His spectacular downfall fascinated the public, the scheming husband exposed, the family business rescued by the rightful heiress. The subsequent court proceedings revealed the full extent of Richard's crimes. Not only had he systematically looted Mitchell hotels, but he had also committed tax evasion, money laundering, and securities fraud. Former business partners came forward with similar stories, creating a pattern of criminal behavior that prosecutors couldn't ignore. My mother's testimony at his trial was perhaps the most difficult day of the entire ordeal. She sat rigid with tension, avoiding Richard's gaze as she detailed his manipulation and admitted her own complicity. "I was blinded by resentment toward my mother," she admitted on the stand. Richard recognized that weakness and exploited it. "He convinced me that taking control of the hotels was justice for years of feeling secondary to my mother's business. I was wrong, and I will regret my actions for the rest of my life." When asked why she finally chose to testify against her husband, she looked directly at me for the first time in months. "Because my daughter showed me what real strength looks like," she said, her voice breaking. Margaret would have been so proud of her. The corporate battle concluded with the hotel board's unanimous vote to reinstate me as CEO of Mitchell Hotels, with Andrea as COO and Michael returning as CFO. Benjamin would serve as chairman of the board until a permanent replacement could be found. In a poetic coincidence, the final court ruling confirming my full control of the hotel empire came on the same day as my graduation from the hospitality management program. As I accepted my diploma, I felt my grandmother's presence more strongly than ever. "We did it, Grandma," I whispered as I returned to my seat. "Just like you planned." 1 year after Richard's conviction, Mitchell Hotels had not just recovered, but was thriving. The damage he had inflicted was substantial. Staff morale had plummeted, customer confidence had wavered, and our reputation had suffered from the public scandal. But with determination and a clear vision, we had rebuilt stronger than before. My first official act as CEO had been to rehire every loyal employee Richard had terminated, starting with Jessica Ryan in San Francisco. My second was to restore my grandmother's office to its original condition. Down to the antique desk and curated art collection we managed to recover from storage. "Margaret would love what you've done," Andrea remarked as we reviewed quarterly results in that very office, especially the Margaret Mitchell Foundation. The foundation had been my most meaningful initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting women in hospitality and business, providing scholarships, mentorship, and startup funding for female entrepreneurs. We'd allocated 5% of all hotel profits to fund its operations, ensuring my grandmother's legacy would extend beyond the properties themselves. "She'd be even happier about our occupancy rates," I smiled, pointing to the latest figures. "We're outperforming our luxury competitors by 12%. Our success came from a careful balance of tradition and innovation. We had preserved the personalized service and elegant ambiance that had always distinguished Mitchell Hotels, while introducing modern sustainability practices and technology that improved the guest experience without intruding upon it." The road to reconciliation with my mother had been longer and more complex. After Richard's conviction and subsequent imprisonment for financial crimes, she had moved into a small apartment, declining my offer to return to the family mansion. "I need to find out who Catherine Mitchell is without a husband or a mother defining me," she had explained. "I've never really stood on my own." Our weekly lunches had started awkwardly, but gradually evolved into something resembling a genuine relationship, perhaps the first we'd ever had, without resentment or competition shadowing our interactions. She volunteered at the foundation, finding unexpected fulfillment in mentoring young women and sharing cautionary tales from her own experience. I misjudged her entirely. James commented after meeting my mother at a foundation event. "There's remarkable strength there," once she found it. James himself had become more than a mentor. After the dust settled, our professional collaboration had slowly blossomed into something deeper. His steadfast support during the crisis had revealed his character, and his industry knowledge complemented my own developing expertise. We were taking things slowly, both conscious of the complex dynamics of our initial professor-student relationship. But the foundation for something meaningful had been laid. The Royal Crown Hotel, once nearly sold off to corporate interests, had been lovingly restored to its former glory. We'd modernized its infrastructure while preserving its historic charm, and added a special feature, the Margaret Mitchell Memorial Garden on the rooftop terrace, a beautiful space open to both guests and the public. On the garden's opening day, surrounded by the flowers my grandmother had loved, I unveiled a bronze plaque bearing her favorite business maxim, Success isn't measured by what you gain, but by what you build that outlasts you. Andrea squeezed my hand as the small crowd of employees, family, friends, and business associates applauded. She built something that outlasted even Richard's best efforts to destroy it, she murmured. With some help from her contingency planning, I smiled. Later that evening, alone in my grandmother's restored office, now mine, I opened her journal, rediscovered among her personal effects. Its pages contained not just business strategies, but personal reflections on leadership, family, and legacy. It was like having conversations with her I'd never got to have in life. The true test of a business isn't how it performs when everything goes right, she had written, but how quickly it recovers when everything goes wrong. The same is true of people. How right she had been. The crisis had revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and values I hadn't realized were so deeply ingrained. It had also shown me who could be trusted and who couldn't, lessons that would serve me throughout my career. As I looked out over the New York skyline from the window where my grandmother had once stood, I felt a profound sense of continuity. The hotels were more than buildings or businesses. They were her legacy, physical manifestations of her vision and values. Now they were mine to steward, improve, and eventually pass on. The empire my grandmother built had survived its greatest threat. The path forward was clear, illuminated by her wisdom, and strengthened by the challenges we'd overcome. What's the biggest betrayal you've ever experienced in your family or business life? How did you handle it? I'm interested to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you found value in my journey, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share with anyone who might need encouragement to stand up for their rightful inheritance, whether that's property, a business, or simply their own voice and autonomy. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the greatest strength comes from facing those who underestimate you and proving them wrong.